Whispering Village. Chapter 1. Twilight hung over Gloomhaven like a threadbare shroud, never lifting, never falling. In this perpetual dusk, Elara Nightshade moved through the cobblestone streets, a living shadow among the gray. Her eyes, unnaturally large and luminous, darted from doorway to alley, watching for the sideways glances and hastily drawn curtains that always heralded her approach. The gas lamps sputtered to life, their weak flames barely piercing the gloom. Elara's reflection caught in a shop window, pale skin, raven hair piled high in elaborate coils, and a black lace dress that whispered of bygone eras. She was a painting out of time, a smudge of ink on Gloomhaven's dreary canvas. "Cursed," came the familiar whisper, slithering from behind a half-closed shutter. Elara's steps faltered, but she pressed on, chin held high. The Nightshade cottage loomed ahead, tilting precariously at the town's edge where civilization gave way to the whispering woods. As Elara approached, the gnarled trees seemed to lean in, their branches reaching like grasping fingers. Inside, the house creaked a melancholy welcome. Elara lit a candle, its flame casting writhing shadows across walls, papered with faded botanical prints. She climbed the narrow stairs to her attic sanctuary, each step groaning secrets beneath her feet. The attic was a treasure trove of oddities, jars of preserved specimens, books with titles in languages long dead, and mirrors of every shape and size. Elara sank onto a velvet-cushioned stool before her vanity, eyes locking with her reflection. "Another day survived," she murmured, voice low and melodic in the stillness. Her fingers worked deftly, unpinning the elaborate coiffure. As ebony tresses tumbled down, Elara could have sworn she heard the faintest giggle. She leaned closer to the mirror, scrutinizing every curl and shadow. For a heartbeat, she thought she glimpsed a tiny, luminous eye peering out from the inky depths of her hair. But it was gone in a blink, leaving her to wonder if the loneliness had finally driven her mad. A church bell tolled in the distance 9, doleful chimes that shuddered through the twilit air. Elara tensed, remembering the whispered warnings of old Mabel, the town's librarian. When the night is young and the moon is shy, that's when the shadows come alive. As if summoned by the thought, a chill wind rattled the attic's single window. Beyond the warped glass, the whispering woods writhed, and for a moment, Elara could have sworn she saw faces in the twisting branches, ancient, knowing, and hungry. She drew the heavy velvet curtains with a shaking hand, shutting out the night and its secrets. But as she turned back to her room, a single gossamer-thin shadow detached itself from her hair, dancing across the floorboards before vanishing beneath the door. Elara froze, heart thundering in her chest. In 16 years of isolation and whispered curses, she had never felt so acutely that she stood on the precipice of something vast and terrifying. As she sank onto her bed, the candlelight guttered, plunging the room into darkness. In that moment, as Gloomhaven settled into its uneasy night, Elara Nightshade knew with bone-deep certainty that everything was about to change. And in the shadows of her hair, something shifted, waiting to be discovered. Chapter 2. Dawn never truly broke in Gloomhaven. Instead, the oppressive twilight merely softened, like a bruise fading on tired skin. Elara emerged from her cottage, stepping into a world perpetually caught between dreaming and waking. The town's square unfolded before her, a tableau of Victorian decay. The dry fountain at its center stood sentinel, its stone cherubs weeping rust instead of water. Around it, shop fronts huddled close, their faded signs creaking in a wind that whispered of secrets. Elara's footsteps echoed hollowly as she made her way across the square. Eyes peered from behind lace curtains, quickly averting when she glanced their way. The daily dance of avoidance had begun. "Morning, Miss Nightshade," came a gravelly voice. Old Mabel stood in the doorway of the library, her spine as curved as the books she tended. "Seems the mist is thick with portent today." Elara paused, offering a small smile. "Is that so, Mabel? And what might it portend?" The old woman's eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, darted to the looming church spires. "Change, child, the air tastes of change, and danger." Before Elara could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the schoolhouse. A group of children burst into the square, their laughter a jarring counterpoint to Gloomhaven's somber mood. At their center was Lily Thornwood, her golden curls bouncing as she skipped. For a moment, Lily's eyes met Elara's. There was no fear there, only curiosity quickly masked by a shy smile. But then Mrs. Thornwood appeared, her face pinched with worry as she hurried Lily away, casting a fearful glance at Elara. The square fell silent once more, broken only by the rhythmic ticking emanating from the clock tower. Elara turned, craning her neck to peer up at the imposing structure. In a high window, she caught a glimpse of Thaddeus Gloom, his silhouette hunched over some intricate mechanism. As she watched, the clock hands aligned at the hour, and a mournful chime reverberated through the town. In that moment, a cold wind gusted through the square, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something ancient and hungry. Elara shivered, wrapping her shawl tighter. She could have sworn she saw shadows detach themselves from the corners of buildings, slithering across the cobblestones before vanishing into the ever-present mist. "Best hurry along, Miss Nightshade," old Mabel called, her voice quavering. "Some days the shadows have teeth." With a nod, Elara quickened her pace, heading towards the edge of town, where Madame Vex's caravan stood in defiance of Gloomhaven's gloom. As she walked, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were upon her, not the usual stares of the townspeople, but something other, something that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. The whispering woods loomed closer, its gnarled branches reaching for her like grasping fingers. A chorus of whispers seemed to rise from its depths, speaking in a language just beyond comprehension. Elara hesitated at the threshold where town gave way to wilderness. Behind her lay the suffocating familiarity of Gloomhaven's judgment. Ahead, the unknown dangers of the forest and the promise of answers from Madame Vex. As she stood there, caught between two worlds, a tiny voice spoke from within the elaborate coils of her hair. "The woods know your name, Elara Nightshade," it giggled. "Do you dare to learn theirs?" Elara's heart raced, equal parts terror and exhilaration, coursing through her veins. With one last look at the town that had never truly been home, she stepped into the shadows of the whispering woods, unaware that with each step, she was walking deeper into a century-old mystery that would change Gloomhaven forever. Chapter 3. The whispering woods enveloped Elara like a living shroud, its canopy blocking what little light filtered through Gloomhaven's perpetual twilight. Gnarled roots seemed to shift beneath her feet, guiding, or perhaps misleading, her deeper into the forest's embrace. As she navigated the twisted path to Madame Vex's caravan, the air grew thick with an otherworldly perfume. Bioluminescent fungi pulsed in the shadows, their eerie glow painting Elara's pale skin in shades of ethereal blue and violet. "Careful, careful," came a tiny voice from within her hair, so faint she almost believed she'd imagined it. "The trees have eyes, and the shadows have hunger." Elara froze, her heart a frantic bird against her ribcage. "Who's there?" she whispered, voice trembling. A giggle, like the tinkling of minute bells, answered her. From the corner of her eye, she caught a flicker of movement. Slowly, she turned to face her reflection in a pool of still black water. There, nestled in the elaborate coils of her hair, peered a tiny, luminous face. Gossamer wings fluttered, and eyes like liquid starlight blinked up at her. "Hello, Elara Nightshade," the creature chirped, its voice a melody of mischief and ancient secrets. "We've been waiting ever so long to meet you properly." Elara's breath caught in her throat. "We." As if in answer, her hair came alive with movement. Tiny beings emerged from its depths, some no larger than her fingernail, others the size of small birds. Their wings shimmered with colors that shouldn't exist, bodies wreathed in shadows that moved of their own accord. "I am Whisper," said the first fairy, bowing with a flourish. "And we are the Forgotten Folk, bound to the Shadow Feeder's will, and now it seems to you." Elara's mind reeled. The fairy folk of legend, living in her hair? It was too fantastical, too horrifying to be real. And yet... "The Shadow Feeder," she breathed, remembering old Mabel's cryptic warnings. "What is it? What does it want?" Whisper's luminous eyes darkened. "It hungers, always hungers, for innocence, for light, for..." A crash echoed through the woods, startling a flock of ravens into flight. Their wings beat a frantic rhythm as they fled, cawing warnings to the night. "Hide," Whisper hissed, and in an instant, the fairies vanished back into the sanctuary of Elara's hair. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by labored breathing and the jangle of keys. From between the twisted trees emerged Constable Flint, his usually pristine uniform disheveled, face pale with barely contained panic. "Miss Nightshade," he called, squinting into the gloom. "What in blazes are you doing out here? It's not safe, especially not tonight." Elara straightened, willing her racing heart to calm. "I was on my way to see Madame Vex. Is something wrong, Constable?" Flint's expression darkened. "It's young Timothy Hollow. He's gone missing. His mother swears she saw shadows swallow him up, right from his bed." He shook his head, disbelief warring with fear in his eyes. "Madness, of course, but..." A chill ran down Elara's spine, colder than the mists that clung to Gloomhaven's streets. In her hair, she felt the fairies tremble. "The cycle begins anew," Whisper's voice breathed in her ear, so softly she might have imagined it. Flint was still talking, something about a search party and staying indoors, but Elara barely heard him. Her mind whirled with the implications of what she'd discovered, of the terrible truth that seemed to be unfolding. As the constable ushered her back towards town, Elara cast one last glance at the depths of the Whispering Woods. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw a pair of ancient, hungry eyes staring back at her from the darkness. The wind picked up, carrying with it the laughter of children and the scent of decay. In that moment, Elara knew with chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. The Shadow Feeder had awakened, and Gloomhaven's long-buried secrets were clawing their way to the surface. As she stepped back into the false safety of the town's borders, Elara felt the weight of destiny settle upon her shoulders. Whatever was coming, she knew she would be at the heart of it for better or for worse. Chapter 4. The news of Timothy Hollow's disappearance spread through Gloomhaven like a noxious fog, seeping into every shadowed corner and whispered conversation. Elara watched from her attic window as lanterns bobbed in the perpetual twilight, searchers calling out with voices edged in desperation. "They won't find him," Whisper's voice came, soft as a moth's wing against her ear. "The Shadow Feeder doesn't give back what it takes." Elara's fingers trembled as she plaited her hair, weaving the fairy folk deeper into her midnight tresses. "Then what hope is there?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The fairy's laughter tinkled like breaking icicles. "Oh, in Gloomhaven, oh Elara Nightshade, you are a strange one indeed." A knock at the door downstairs startled them both into silence. Elara descended the creaking stairs, each step an exercise in trepidation. She opened the door to find Lily Thornwood, eyes wide and brimming with unshed tears. "Elara," Lily breathed, glancing nervously over her shoulder. I need your help. I've seen things in the shadows, things that shouldn't be." For a moment, Elara hesitated. Helping Lily meant crossing a threshold, stepping fully into a world of dark whimsy and ancient horrors. But the pleading in the young girl's eyes steeled her resolve. "Come in," Elara said, ushering Lily inside. "Tell me everything." As Lily recounted her tale of whispering shadows and glimpses of otherworldly beings, Elara felt the fairy folk stirring in her hair, their agitation palpable. When Lily mentioned a strange, haunting lullaby that seemed to call to her from the dark, Whisper gasped. "The shadow feeder's song," the fairy hissed. "It's choosing its next feast." Elara's blood ran cold. She knelt before Lily, taking the girl's trembling hands in her own. "Lily, I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Lily nodded, her golden curls bouncing. "Is it true what they say about you, Elara, that you're different?" A sad smile tugged at Elara's lips. "Oh, Lily, you have no idea." With a deep breath, Elara closed her eyes and focused. She felt the fairy folk respond, their magic thrumming through her veins. When she opened her eyes, she knew they glowed with an otherworldly light. Lily gasped, but didn't pull away. "You're beautiful," she whispered in awe. "Listen carefully," Elara said, her voice overlaid with the chiming tones of the fairy folk. "The shadows are hungry, and they've set their sights on you. But I won't let them take you, Lily, I promise." As if summoned by her words, the room darkened. Shadows peeled away from the corners, writhing with malevolent purpose. Lily whimpered, pressing closer to Elara. "Sing, Elara," Whisper urged. "Sing the psalm of the Twilight Guardian." Words Elara had never known she knew spilled from her lips, a melody both haunting and defiant. As she sang, light bloomed from her hair, from her eyes, from her very skin. The shadows recoiled, hissing in fury. In that moment of illumination, the veil between worlds thinned. Elara saw glimpses of the Shadow Feeder's realm, a place of twisted beauty and primordial terror. She saw the missing children, suspended in a twilight sleep, and the ancient hunger that craved their innocence. The vision faded as abruptly as it had come. Elara found herself on the floor, cradling a sobbing Lily. The shadows had retreated, but she could feel their malevolent gaze lingering. What was that?" Lily hiccuped, looking up at Elara with a mixture of fear and wonder. Elara smoothed Lily's hair, her own hands shaking. "That, my dear, was your first step beyond the veil, and I fear it's only the beginning." As if to punctuate her words, the church bells began to toll, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. In her hair, the fairy folk shuddered. "The Shadow Feeder knows you now, Elara Nightshade," Whisper warned. "The game has truly begun." Elara stood, helping Lily to her feet. She looked out the window at the mist-shrouded town, feeling the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders. "Then let it come," she said, a fierce determination blazing in her otherworldly eyes. "Gloomhaven has lived in fear for too long. It's time someone stood against the dark." As night fell over the haunted town, Elara Nightshade made a silent vow. She would unravel the mysteries of Gloomhaven, face the Shadow Feeder, and bring an end to the cycle of fear and loss. The path ahead was shrouded in shadow, but for the first time in her life, Elara felt a glimmer of something long forgotten in Gloomhaven: hope. Chapter 5. Dawn's feeble light struggled to penetrate Gloomhaven's ever-present gloom as Elara set out for Madame Vex's caravan. The events of the previous night had left her shaken, the weight of her newfound responsibility pressing down upon her like a leaden shroud. The town was unnaturally quiet, windows shuttered tight against the encroaching shadows. As Elara passed the church, she caught sight of Reverend Holloway, his face a mask of grim determination as he nailed protective charms to the ancient wooden doors. "Best hurry along, Miss Nightshade," he called, his voice quavering. "These are dark times, and darker still for those who dabble in unusual affairs." Elara quickened her pace, the Reverend's words echoing ominously in her mind. In her hair, whispers stirred. "He knows more than he lets on," the fairy murmured. "The church has long been the keeper of Gloomhaven's darkest secrets." The path to Madame Vex's caravan wound through the outskirts of the Whispering Woods. Here, the trees grew dense and twisted, their branches forming grotesque arches over the trail. Elara could have sworn she saw faces in the gnarled bark, watching her with ancient, knowing eyes. At last, the caravan came into view. It was a riot of color, in Gloomhaven's monochrome world, vibrant purples and deep crimsons painted in swirling patterns across its wooden surface. Wisps of sweet-smelling smoke curled from its chimney, and the air thrummed with an otherworldly energy. Before Elara could knock, the door swung open of its own accord. "Enter, child," came a voice like velvet over gravel. "The cards have long foretold your coming." Elara stepped inside, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The caravan was larger within and should have been possible, its walls lined with shelves crammed full of arcane objects and ancient tomes. At a table draped in midnight blue velvet sat Madame Vex. Her silver hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall of moonlight, and her eyes, one amber, one violet, seemed to peer straight into Elara's soul. "So," Madame Vex said, her painted lips curving into a knowing smile, "the Nightshade child has finally awakened to her heritage. Tell me, girl, what do you see when you look in the mirror now?" Elara swallowed hard. "I see potential and terror." Madame Vex's laughter was like the chiming of dark bells. "Good answer said, child. We have much to discuss and precious little time." As Elara took her seat, the air around them seemed to thicken. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, and she could have sworn she heard distant, childlike laughter. "The shadow feeder grows stronger," Madame Vex said, her voice low and urgent. "With each child it takes, its hunger only increases. But you, Elara Nightshade, you carry the blood of those who once stood against it." "What do you mean?" Elara asked, leaning forward. "What do you know about my family?" Madame Vex's mismatched eyes gleamed. "Your ancestors were the Twilight Guardians, tasked with keeping the balance between light and shadow, but they failed, and Gloomhaven has paid the price for generations." The witch's words sent a chill down Elara's spine. In her hair, the fairy folk trembled. "But now you're here," Madame Vex continued, reaching out to grasp Elara's hand. Her touch was ice cold. "The last of the Nightshade line, with the power to either save Gloomhaven or doom us all." Suddenly, the caravan plunged into darkness. Elara heard Whisper's panicked cry, felt the fairy folk burrowing deeper into her hair. When light returned, it came in the form of ethereal flames dancing in Madame Vex's palms. "Listen carefully, child," the witch said, her voice taking on an otherworldly resonance. "To defeat the Shadow Feeder, you must first understand it, Its lair lies beneath the church, in catacombs older than Gloomhaven itself. But beware, knowledge comes at a price, and the shadows have ears. As if summoned by her words, a tendril of darkness slithered across the floor, reaching for Elara. Without thinking, she sang out, the melody of the Twilight Guardian rising unbidden to her lips. Light blossomed from her skin, driving the shadow back. Madame Bex smiled, a fierce pride in her eyes. Good, you're learning, but remember, Elara light casts shadows, and in Gloomhaven, shadows have teeth. As Elara left the caravan, her mind reeling from all she had learned, the whispering woods seemed to press closer. The wind carried whispers of ancient secrets and terrible warnings. The path ahead is treacherous, Whisper said softly. Are you ready to face what lies in the dark? Elara squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of generations resting upon them. I have to be, she replied. For Timothy, for Lily, for all of Gloomhaven, it's time to bring light back to this town, whatever the cost. As she made her way back towards town, Elara felt a shift in the air, a sense that wheels long set in motion were beginning to turn. The game between light and shadow had begun in earnest, and she stood at its center, a beacon of hope in Gloomhaven's endless twilight. Chapter 6. The Gloomhaven town square buzzed with an undercurrent of fear, its usual dreary atmosphere charged with electric tension. Elara stepped into this maelstrom of whispers and sidelong glances, her newfound knowledge weighing heavily upon her. As she navigated the cobblestone streets, a cacophony of clockwork chimes erupted from the looming tower. Elara glanced up to see Thaddeus Gloom's silhouette framed in the highest window, his hands dancing over an intricate array of gears and levers. Time marks the Shadowfeeder's hunger, Whisper's voice tickled her ear, and the clockmaker knows its rhythms better than most. Before Elara could ponder this, a commotion near the dry fountain caught her attention. Mayor Grimstone stood atop a makeshift platform, his jowls quivering as he addressed the gathering crowd. Citizens of Gloomhaven, his voice boomed, tinged with barely concealed panic. In light of recent events, a curfew will be strictly enforced. For your own safety, remain indoors after nightfall. Elara edged closer, acutely aware of the eyes that followed her every move. In the crowd, she spotted Lily Formwood, the young girl's face a mixture of fear and determination as she clung to her mother's skirts. What about Timothy? A voice cried out. What's being done to find him? Mayor Grimstone's face darkened. Rest assured, every effort is being made. Constable Flint and his men are leaving no stone unturned. Lies, hissed Whisper. They search, but they do not seek. The shadows hold their tongues and cloud their minds. As the mayor continued his platitudes, Elara felt a presence at her side. She turned to find Reverend Holloway, his eyes sunken and haunted. Miss Nightshade, he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. I wonder if you might spare a moment of your time. There are matters we must discuss. Elara nodded, following the Reverend as he led her away from the crowd. They walked in silence until they reached the church's imposing doors. I've seen you, child, Reverend Holloway said, his gaze darting nervously to the shadows that clung to the eaves. In the twilight hours, when the veil is thinnest, you shine with a light long forgotten in Gloomhaven. Elara's heart raced. What do you know of the Shadowfeeder, Reverend? The old man's face crumpled in anguish. Too much, and yet not enough. The church has guarded its secrets for generations, but now... He trailed off, his eyes focusing on something beyond Elara's shoulder. She turned to see Thaddeus Gloom approaching, his gait uneven, the tick-tock of countless timepieces emanating from his pockets. Reverend, Thaddeus nodded, his eyes never leaving Elara. I believe it's time we pooled our knowledge. The gears are turning faster now, and the shadows grow bolder with each passing hour. As if to emphasize his words, a gust of wind swept through the square, carrying with it the laughter of children and the scent of decay. Elara shivered, feeling the fairy folk nestle deeper into her hair. "Come," Reverend Holloway said, pushing open the church doors. "We have much to discuss and precious little time." As they entered the sanctuary, Elara gasped. The interior was a riot of symbols and wards, every surface covered in intricate patterns designed to hold back the dark. "The Nightshade legacy," Thaddeus mused, his fingers tracing a familiar crest carved into a pew. "It's woven into the very fabric of Gloomhaven's history, and now it falls to you, Elara, to unravel the knots of our past." Reverend Holloway nodded solemnly. "The catacombs beneath us hold the answers you seek, child, but be warned, knowledge comes at a terrible price in Gloomhaven." As if in response, the shadows in the corners of the church seemed to deepen, writhing with malevolent purpose. Elara felt a surge of power course through her, the legacy of the Twilight Guardians awakening in her blood. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever the cost, whatever the danger, I have to try for Timothy, for Lily, for all of Gloomhaven." Thaddeus and the Reverend exchanged a look fraught with meaning. "Very well," Thaddeus said, producing an ancient key from within his clockwork-laden coat. "Let us descend into the heart of Gloomhaven's darkness. The time has come to face the shadows that have haunted us for far too long." As they moved towards a hidden door behind the altar, Elara felt the weight of destiny settle upon her shoulders. The fairy folk hummed with anticipation in her hair, and she could have sworn she heard Whisper's voice, carried on the stale air of the church. "The game begins in earnest now, Elara Nightshade. Light and shadow dance on the edge of a blade, and you, dear girl, are the fulcrum upon which Gloomhaven's fate balances." With a deep breath, Elara stepped forward, ready to plunge into the depths of Gloomhaven's darkest secrets. The catacombs awaited, and with them, the terrible truth of the Shadowfeeder's origins. Chapter 7. The descent into the catacombs beneath Gloomhaven's church was like sinking into a pool of liquid shadow. Elara led the way, her newfound inner light casting a soft, ethereal glow that barely pushed back the pressing darkness. Behind her, Reverend Holloway muttered prayers under his breath, while Thaddeus Gloom's pockets chimed a discordant melody with each step. As they ventured deeper, the air grew thick with the scent of ancient stone and forgotten secrets. Whisper's voice, usually so chipper, was now a trembling whisper in Elara's ear. "The veil is thin here. Twilight Guardian, be wary of what might slip through." The narrow passage opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. Elara's light revealed rows upon rows of stone sarcophagi, their surfaces etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. "The founders of Gloomhaven," Reverend Holloway intoned, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Those who first made the pact with the Shadowfeeder." Thaddeus stepped forward, his clockwork instruments whirring and clicking. "And here," he said, pointing to a circular dais in the center of the chamber, "is where the bargain was struck." As Elara approached the dais, the shadows around them surged with sudden vitality. Inky tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Reverend Holloway's ankles and Thaddeus's wrists. They cried out in alarm, struggling against the darkness that sought to drag them away. "Elara," Thaddeus yelled, his voice strained. "The shadows test you. You must prove yourself worthy of your legacy." Heart pounding, Elara felt panic rising in her throat. But then, unbidden, a melody rose to her lips, the song of the Twilight Guardians, passed down through generations of Nightshades. As she sang, light blossomed from her skin, from her eyes, from the very air around her. The shadows recoiled, hissing in fury. In that moment of illumination, Elara saw glimpses of Gloomhaven's past, the desperate founders making their dark bargain, generations of children sacrificed to sate an ancient hunger, and her own ancestors standing guard against the encroaching night. "Don't fight the visions," Whisper urged. "Embrace them, learn from them." Elara let the images wash over her, each one a piece of the puzzle that was Gloomhaven's curse. She saw the Shadow Feeder in its true form, a being of primal darkness, beautiful and terrible in its hunger. And she saw herself, standing at the crossroads of past and future, a flickering flame against an ocean of shadow. As the visions faded, Elara found herself on her knees on the dais, gasping for breath. The shadows had retreated, leaving Reverend Holloway and Thaddeus shaken, but unharmed. "By all the gears and springs," Thaddeus breathed, staring at Elara with a mixture of awe and fear. "I've never seen such power." Reverend Holloway nodded solemnly. "The Nightshade legacy lives on in you, child, but remember, with great power comes great danger. The Shadow Feeder will not rest until it has snuffed out your light." Elara rose unsteadily to her feet, her mind reeling from all she had seen and learned. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice small in the vastness of the catacombs. "Now," said Whisper, materializing on her shoulder in a shimmer of starlight, visible to all for the first time, "you prepare for war, Twilight Guardian. The Shadow Feeder knows you have awakened, and it will throw everything it has against you." As if in response to the fairy's words, a cold wind howled through the chamber, carrying with it the distant cries of the lost children and the hungry growl of ancient shadows. Thaddeus stepped forward, his clockwork creations ticking with renewed purpose. "We'll stand with you. Elara. Gloomhaven has cowered in fear for too long. It's time we fought back." Reverend Holloway placed a gnarled hand on Elara's shoulder. "The path ahead is fraught with peril, my dear, but you do not walk it alone. The light of hope shines in Gloomhaven once more, thanks to you." Elara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her destiny settling upon her shoulders. The fairy folk stirred in her hair, their magic humming in harmony with the power awakening in her blood. "Then let us return to the surface," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We have a town to save, children to rescue, and a Shadow Feeder to banish." As they made their way back up to the church, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The true test lay ahead, in the shadowed streets of Gloomhaven and the darkness that lurked in every heart. But for the first time in her life, Elara Nightshade felt ready to face whatever horrors the night might bring. The game had truly begun, and Gloomhaven's fate hung in the balance. Chapter 8. As Elara emerged from the church with Reverend Holloway and Thaddeus, Gloomhaven seemed to have sunk even deeper into its perpetual twilight. The air hung heavy with a palpable dread, and shadows danced at the corners of her vision, more alive than ever before. "The Shadow Feeder stirs," Whisper murmured, now perched visibly on Elara's shoulder. The tiny fairy's presence, once a secret, now stood as a beacon of the strange reality unfolding in the town. No sooner had they stepped into the square than a bone-chilling scream rent the air. Elara's heart leapt to her throat as she recognized the voice Lily Thornwood. Without hesitation, she broke into a run, her newfound allies struggling to keep pace. They rounded a corner to find a scene of nightmarish proportions unfolding before the Thornwood residence. Lily stood frozen in the street, her eyes wide with terror, as tendrils of living darkness wrapped around her ankles. Mrs. Thornwood clawed desperately at the shadows, her hands passing through them as if they were smoke. "Elara!" Lily cried out, reaching towards her with trembling hands. Time seemed to slow. Elara felt the power of the Twilight Guardian surge within her, but before she could act, the world around them shifted. The streets of Gloomhaven melted away, replaced by a landscape of twisted beauty and primordial terror. The sky above swirled with colors that shouldn't exist, and the ground beneath their feet pulsed like a living thing. The Shadow Feeder's realm, Thaddeus gasped, his clockwork devices whirring frantically. They stood upon a vast plain of shifting shadows, dotted with crystalline structures that seemed to sing with an otherworldly resonance. In the distance, a towering citadel of darkness rose, its spires piercing the impossible sky. And there, suspended in midair like puppets on invisible strings, were the missing children of Gloomhaven. Their eyes were open but unseeing, expressions frozen in a rictus of terror and wonder. "Timothy," Irvin Holloway cried out, spotting the boy they had come to save. But it was Lily who drew Elara's attention. The young girl floated at the edge of the group, shadows still curling around her limbs, pulling her deeper into this nightmare realm. A voice like the death of stars echoed across the plain, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome, Twilight Guardian," it purred, sending shivers down Elara's spine. "How kind of you to deliver yourself to me. Your light will be a feast indeed." From the shadows emerged a figure that defied description, a being of pure darkness given form, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Its eyes, if they could be called that, fixed upon Elara with hungry intent. "The Shadow Feeder," Whisper breathed, trembling on Elara's shoulder. Elara felt fear threaten to overwhelm her, but she pushed it down, drawing upon the strength of her ancestors. Light bloomed from her skin, pushing back the encroaching shadows. "Release them," she demanded, her voice carrying the power of generations of nightshades. "Release the children and leave Gloomhaven in peace." The Shadow Feeder's laughter was like the shattering of 1,000 mirrors. "Peace, oh, my dear sweet child. There can be no peace while light and shadow dance their eternal waltz. But come, let me show you the true nature of the bargain your ancestors struck." With a gesture, the air around them shimmered, and Elara saw visions of Gloomhaven's past, the desperate founders calling upon ancient powers, the first children taken as payment for the town's protection, the slow corruption of hope over centuries. "You see," the Shadow Feeder crooned, "they chose this generation after generation. They fed me their young to keep the greater darkness at bay. Will you be the one to break that covenant, Elara Nightshade, to doom your precious town to the horrors that lurk beyond my realm?" Elara's mind reeled, the weight of Gloomhaven's history pressing down upon her. But as she looked at the suspended children, at Lily's terrified face, she felt a resolve harden within her. "No more," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The cycle ends now." Light exploded from Elara, momentarily banishing the shadows. In that instant of illumination, she caught a glimpse of fear in the Shadow Feeder's fathomless eyes. The world lurched, and suddenly they were back in the streets of Gloomhaven. Lily fell to the ground, free of the shadow's grasp, and Mrs. Thornwood swept her into a fierce embrace. But Elara knew this was far from over. The Shadow Feeder's laughter echoed in her mind, a promise of battles yet to come. "Well done, Twilight Guardian," Thaddeus said, his voice filled with awe and trepidation. "But I fear you've only angered the beast. The true test lies ahead." Reverend Holloway nodded solemnly. "We've been granted a glimpse of our adversary's world, a peek behind the veil. Now we must prepare for war." As the townsfolk began to gather, drawn by the commotion, Elara stood tall. The fairy folk shimmered in her hair, Whisper a steady presence on her shoulder. For the first time, she didn't shy away from the stares and whispers. "Spread the word," she said, her voice carrying across the square. Gloomhaven has lived in fear for too long. It's time we fought back against the shadows. As night fell over the haunted town, a spark of hope flickered to life fragile, but growing stronger with each passing moment. The battle for Gloomhaven's soul had begun in earnest, and Elara Nightshade stood at its heart, a beacon of light against the encroaching dark. Chapter 9. The Nightshade cottage creaked and groaned under the weight of long-buried secrets as Elara rummaged through the attic. Dust motes danced in the pale light, filtering through the grimy windows, each one a potential fairy in disguise. There must be something here, Elara muttered, her fingers tracing the spines of ancient tomes and weathered journals. Some clue to my family's past, to the power I've inherited. Whisper flitted about, his luminous wings casting eerie shadows on the walls. The answers you seek may not be written in ink, Twilight Guardian. Some truths are etched in blood and shadow. As if in response to the fairy's words, Elara's hand brushed against a small, ornate box tucked behind a stack of moldering papers. The moment her skin made contact, a jolt of energy surged through her, and the lock sprang open with a soft click. Inside lay a collection of items that seemed mundane at first glance: a tarnished locket, a handful of pressed flowers, a child's worn shoe. But as Elara lifted each object, visions flashed before her eyes, fragments of lives long past. The locket showed her a woman with Elara's eyes, standing defiantly before a writhing mass of shadows. The flowers whispered of midnight rituals in forest glades, of bargains struck and prices paid. And the shoe carried the weight of generations of loss, of children sacrificed to keep the darkness at bay. Your ancestors, Whisper said softly, perching on the edge of the box. The Twilight Guardians who came before, they fought, they loved, they lost, and they left you this legacy. Tears stung Elara's eyes as the weight of her inheritance truly settled upon her shoulders. But why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why didn't they end this cycle? Why pass on this burden? A knock at the door startled them both. Elara hastily wiped her eyes and descended the stairs, the box clutched tightly to her chest. She opened the door to find Thaddeus gloom, his pockets ticking and whirring with nervous energy. Miss Nightshade, he said, his eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to lengthen around them. I made a discovery in the old town records, something your family would want you to see. Elara nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. As Thaddeus spread out ancient maps and documents on the kitchen table, Elara felt a shift in the air. The cottage seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls were listening. Your great-great-grandmother, Thaddeus began, pointing to a faded photograph of a stern-faced woman. Amarantha Nightshade, she came closest to breaking the cycle, to banishing the shadow feeder once and for all. What happened? Elara asked, leaning in to study the image of her ancestor. Thaddeus's expression grew grim. She discovered that to truly defeat the shadow feeder, one must venture into its realm and confront it on its own territory. But the price? He trailed off, his hands trembling slightly. The price? Elara prompted, though a part of her dreaded the answer. A willing sacrifice, Whisper chimed in, his tiny face solemn. A soul of pure light to balance the scales of darkness. The implications hung heavy in the air. Elara's mind raced, connecting threads of family history, town lore, and her own burgeoning powers. She couldn't do it, Elara realized aloud. She couldn't sacrifice an innocent to end the cycle. Thaddeus nodded. So instead, she strengthened the wards, bought Gloomhaven more time, but she knew, as I suspect you now know, that it was only a temporary solution. As if summoned by their conversation, A cold wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Shadows deepened in the corners of the room, and Elara could have sworn she heard distant, childlike laughter carried on the breeze. "It's calling to you," Thaddeus said quietly. "The Shadow Feeder, it senses the power in your blood, the potential to end this once and for all." Elara's hand went to the locket she now wore around her neck, feeling the weight of generations within its tarnished surface. "I won't let it win," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I won't let it take any more children, any more innocence." Whisper alighted on her shoulder, his light pulsing in harmony with the power thrumming through Elara's veins. "The path ahead is treacherous, Twilight Guardian. To face the Shadow Feeder in its own realm is to risk everything." "I know," Elara said, her resolve hardening. "But I also know I'm not alone. I have the strength of my ancestors, the wisdom of Gloomhaven's protectors, and the light of hope on my side." As night fell over the haunted town, Elara Nightshade stood framed in the window of her family's cottage, her silhouette a beacon against the encroaching darkness. The secrets of her past now lay bare, illuminating the path forward. The final confrontation loomed on the horizon, a battle not just for Gloomhaven's future, but for the very balance between light and shadow. And at its heart stood Elara, the last of the Nightshades, ready to face her destiny whatever the cost. Chapter 10. The clock tower chimed midnight, its doleful tones echoing through Gloomhaven's misty streets. Elara stood in the town square, her hair writhing with the agitated movements of the fairy folk. Around her gathered an unlikely assembly: Thaddeus Gloom, his pockets ticking like a legion of anxious crickets; Reverend Holloway, clutching a tome of ancient prayers; Madame Vex, her mismatched eyes gleaming with arcane knowledge; and to Elara's surprise, young Lily Thornwood, defiant despite her mother's protests. "Are you certain about this, Miss Nightshade?" Thaddeus asked, his voice quavering. "To summon the Shadow Feeder's emissary, it's not without risk." Elara nodded, her resolve firm despite the flutter of fear in her chest. "We need answers, and sometimes you have to invite the darkness in to truly understand it." As the group formed a circle, Elara began to sing. It was a melody older than Gloomhaven itself, passed down through generations of Nightshades. As her voice rose and fell, weaving a tapestry of sound, the very air around them began to shimmer. Shadows deepened and stretched, coalescing into a form both beautiful and terrible. Before them stood a being that seemed crafted from the stuff of nightmares and dreams, the Shadow Feeder's emissary. "Well, well," it purred, its voice like silk over broken glass. "The Twilight Guardian seeks an audience, how quaint." Elara stepped forward, her skin glowing with an inner light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. "We want to know the truth," she demanded. "About the pact, about the children, about the balance between light and shadow." The emissary's laughter was a cascade of discordant bells. "Truth, oh my dear, truth is such a fickle thing, but very well. Let us play a game. For every question you ask, I shall give you a truth and a lie. Discern between them, and you may yet save your precious Gloomhaven." What followed was a dizzying dance of riddles and revelations. With each question, the emissary wove fact and fiction together so deftly that separating them seemed an impossible task. Yet Elara persevered, drawing upon the wisdom of her ancestors and the collective knowledge of her allies. "The children," Elara asked, her voice trembling. "Why does the Shadow Feeder take them?" The emissary's eyes glittered like black diamonds. "To feast upon their innocence and grow ever stronger," it said. "Or perhaps to protect them from a fate far worse than shadows." Elara's mind raced, weighing each word against what she knew of Gloomhaven's history. Both, she breathed, realization dawning. Both are true. The emissary's form flickered, surprise evident in its ever-shifting features. Clever girl, it hissed. But can you handle the weight of such knowledge? As the interrogation continued, a pattern emerged. The Shadow Feeder was both protector and predator, a being of primordial darkness bound by ancient laws. The children it took were both victims and safeguarded treasures, their innocence a bulwark against greater horrors that lurked beyond Gloomhaven's borders. With each truth uncovered, the world around them seemed to warp and shift. Reality itself appeared to bend, revealing glimpses of the Shadow Feeder's realm superimposed over Gloomhaven's familiar streets. Finally, as dawn's feeble light began to creep over the horizon, Elara asked the question that had been burning in her heart. How can the cycle be broken? How can Gloomhaven be freed? The emissary's form began to dissolve, tendrils of shadow reaching back towards the fading night. Its final words hung in the air like a death knell. To break the chains, the Guardian must fall, a willing sacrifice, a heart of light extinguished, or perhaps a darkness embraced. Two halves made whole. Choose wisely, Twilight Guardian. The fate of all hangs in the balance. As the emissary vanished, leaving behind only a lingering chill, Elara felt the weight of destiny settle even more heavily upon her shoulders. The path forward was clearer now, yet fraught with even greater peril than she had imagined. Lily stepped forward, her small hand slipping into Elara's. "You won't face this alone," she said, her young voice filled with a wisdom beyond her years. "We're all part of this story now." Elara looked around at her companions, seeing the determination in their eyes. Even Thaddeus, usually so nervous, stood tall, his clockwork creations humming with purpose. "Indeed we are," Elara said, squeezing Lily's hand. "And it's time we wrote a new ending for Gloomhaven." As the group dispersed, each to prepare in their own way for the battles to come, Elara remained in the square. She watched as the town slowly came to life, its residents unaware of the revelations that had unfolded in the dark hours of the night. Whisper alighted on her shoulder, his tiny face solemn. "The hardest part lies ahead, Twilight Guardian. Are you prepared for what you might have to become?" Elara took a deep breath, feeling the power of light and shadow swirling within her. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know I can't turn back now, for better or worse. Gloomhaven's fate rests in my hands." As she turned to leave, a single shadow detached itself from the others, following in her wake. The middle game was over. The final confrontation loomed, and with it, a choice that would reshape the very fabric of Gloomhaven's reality. Chapter 11. The Nightshade cottage creaked and groaned, as if sharing Elara's inner turmoil. She paced the worn floorboards, her hair a writhing mass of agitated fairy folk. Whisper flitted nervously from perch to perch, his luminescence flickering with concern. "A willing sacrifice," Elara muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or darkness embraced. What kind of choice is that?" The revelations from the Shadow Feeder's emissary weighed heavily upon her. The mantle of the Twilight Guardian, once a source of newfound strength, now felt like a noose slowly tightening around her neck. A gentle knock at the door startled her from her reverie. She opened it to find Lily Thornwood, her young face etched with worry. "Elara," Lily said, her voice small but determined. "I had a dream, I think. I think I know what you have to do." Elara ushered the girl inside, a mix of curiosity and dread churning in her stomach. As Lily recounted her vision, a swirling vortex of light and shadow, Elara standing at its center, making a choice that would reshape reality, the Twilight Guardian felt the walls of fate closing in around her. "But how can I choose?" Elara asked, more to herself than to Lily. How can I sacrifice an innocent or worse, embrace the very darkness we're fighting against? Whisper alighted on her shoulder, his tiny voice filled with ancient wisdom. Perhaps, Twilight Guardian, the choice is not as binary as it seems. Light and shadow, innocence and knowledge, they are two sides of the same coin. As if in response to the fairy's words, the objects from the family box began to glow with an otherworldly light. The locket, the pressed flowers, the child's shoe, each pulsed with the echoes of past guardians, their triumphs and their sacrifices. Elara lifted the locket, and suddenly the room around her melted away. She found herself standing in a moonlit glade, face to face with Elara Nightshade, her great-great-grandmother. You carry a heavy burden, child, Amarantha said, her eyes filled with understanding and sorrow. But remember, the greatest strength often lies in the spaces between extremes. I don't understand, Elara replied, her voice quavering. How can I save Gloomhaven without losing myself in the process? Amarantha's form began to fade, but her words lingered in the air. The heart of a guardian is neither pure light nor pure shadow, but a twilight all its own. Trust in that balance, and you may yet find a path forward. The vision dissolved, and Elara found herself back in the cottage, Lily staring at her with wide-eyed wonder. The girl reached out, taking Elara's hand in her own. You're not alone in this, Lily said, her young voice filled with a wisdom beyond her years. We all have a part to play. As if summoned by Lily's words, a commotion outside drew their attention. Elara opened the door to find Thaddeus, Reverend Holloway, and Madame Vex huddled on her doorstep, their faces a mix of excitement and trepidation. We found something, Thaddeus said, his pockets chiming with nervous energy. In the old clock tower archives, a prophecy, or perhaps a riddle, about the Twilight Guardian's true power. Reverend Holloway nodded solemnly. It speaks of a union, a blending of light and shadow to create something entirely new. The twilight itself, Madame Vex added, her mismatched eyes gleaming. Neither day nor night, but a realm of infinite possibility. As Elara listened to their discoveries, she felt a shift within herself. The doubt that had been gnawing at her began to transform, not into certainty, but into a kind of resolute acceptance of the unknown. I don't have all the answers, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. But I know we can't keep living in fear. Whatever comes next, we face it together. The group gathered in Elara's small living room, maps and ancient texts spread out on every available surface. As they pored over the information, piecing together fragments of lore and prophecy, Elara felt a sense of purpose crystallizing within her. The path ahead was still shrouded in shadow, the ultimate choice still looming. But as she looked around at the unlikely allies, she had gathered a clockmaker, a reverend, a witch, a child, and a host of fairy folk. Elara realized that perhaps the true power of the Twilight Guardian lay not in light or shadow, but in the connections forged between them all. As night fell once more over Gloomhaven, Elara stood at her window, watching the interplay of light and shadow in the misty streets. The final confrontation was drawing near. She could feel it in her bones. But for the first time since this journey began, she felt not just the weight of destiny, but the strength of community at her back. Whatever comes, she whispered to the twilight, we're ready. And in the shadows cast by her own inner light, something shifted. A new possibility taking shape in the spaces between extremes. Chapter 12. As Gloomhaven succumbed to another restless night, Elara Nightshade fell into a fitful sleep, her mind a maelstrom of doubts and half-formed plans. The moment her eyes closed, she found herself plunging into a dreamscape, as vivid as it was bizarre. The world around her was a swirling canvas of twilight hues, purples, blues, and golds, bleeding into one another like watercolors in rain. She stood upon a path that seemed to be made of solidified starlight, stretching endlessly in both directions. "Welcome, Twilight Guardian, to the realm between realms," came a voice that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. It was Whisper, but not as Elara had ever seen him before. The tiny fairy now stood as tall as she, his wings a kaleidoscope of shimmering possibilities. "What is this place?" Elara asked, her voice echoing strangely in the ethereal landscape. "This is the Twilight Realm," Whisper replied, gesturing to the ever-shifting scenery. "The space between light and shadow, where all potentials exist simultaneously." As they walked along the starlight path, Elara saw scenes from Gloomhaven's past, present, and possible futures unfold around them like living tableaux. She witnessed the town's founding, the first pact with the Shadow Feeder, and countless cycles of fear and sacrifice. But she also saw glimpses of hope, children laughing in sunlight that hadn't touched Gloomhaven in centuries, shadows and light dancing in harmonious balance rather than eternal conflict. "Your choice approaches, Twilight Guardian," Whisper in tone, his form flickering between fairy and something far more ancient. "But remember, in Twilight, nothing is ever truly as it seems." The path led them to a circular clearing, where 3 figures awaited: Elara Nightshade, the Shadow Feeder's emissary, and a small shadowy form that Elara recognized with a jolt as herself as a child. "3 paths lie before you," Amarantha said, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "The path of light, of sacrifice, and sorrow." She gestured to a radiant doorway that seemed to lead to a Gloomhaven bathed in perpetual daylight, but at a terrible cost. The emissary's laugh was like shattering crystal. "Or embrace the shadow, and no power beyond your wildest dreams." A portal of writhing darkness opened, promising strength and secrets, but at the price of Elara's humanity. The child Elara stepped forward, her eyes glowing with an inner twilight. "Or perhaps," she said in a voice both young and ancient, "you might forge a new path altogether." As she spoke, the ground beneath them began to shift. The starlight path twisted and turned, forming an intricate labyrinth that seemed to encompass all of Gloomhaven's hopes and fears. "The labyrinth of Twilight," Whisper explained. "A journey through the very essence of balance itself." Elara felt drawn to this third option, but hesitated. "What lies at the center?" she asked. "That," said the child Elara with a smile that held secrets of its own, "depends entirely on you." As Elara took her first step into the labyrinth, the dreamscape around her erupted into a phantasmagoria of memory and possibility. She relived moments from her own life, but also experienced fragments of other Nightshade's journeys. She felt Amarantha's anguish as she strengthened the wards, buying time but prolonging the cycle. She tasted the bittersweet victory of guardians past who had pushed back the shadows, knowing it was only temporary. But most powerfully, she experienced the hopes and fears of Gloomhaven itself, not just its people, but the very land upon which it stood. She felt the town's longing for true balance, for an end to the eternal twilight that was both blessing and curse. As she neared the labyrinth's center, Elara found herself face to face with the Shadow Feeder, in its true form a being of primordial darkness, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. But now, she saw it not as an enemy to be vanquished, but as a necessary part of a greater whole. "You begin to understand," the Shadow Feeder's voice resonated through her very being. "Light and shadow, innocence and knowledge, one cannot exist without the other." Elara reached out, her hand glowing with inner light, and touched the essence of shadow before her. In that moment, she felt a profound shift, as if the very fabric of reality was reweaving itself around her. The true power of the Twilight Guardian, she realized aloud, isn't in choosing light over shadow or shadow over light. It's in embracing both, in becoming the bridge between worlds. As this revelation washed over her, the dreamscape began to fade. Elara felt herself rising back to wakefulness, but the lessons of the Twilight realm lingered. She awoke in her bed, the first rays of Gloomhaven's approximation of dawn filtering through her window. But something had changed. The air itself seemed charged with potential, and the shadows in the corners of her room danced not with menace, but with a kind of playful anticipation. Whisper, once again fairy sighs, alighted on her shoulder. "You've walked the labyrinth of Twilight Guardian," he said, his voice filled with pride and a hint of anticipation. "Now the real work begins." Elara nodded, a new sense of purpose filling her. The final confrontation still loomed, but now she understood that it wasn't about defeating the darkness. It was about finding harmony in the spaces between. As she rose to face the new day, Elara Nightshade felt the power of true twilight coursing through her veins. Gloomhaven's fate hung in the balance, but for the first time, she felt truly ready to shape that fate, not through destruction, but through understanding and unity. The dream had shown her the way. Now it was time to make it a reality. Chapter 13. The day following Elara's surreal dream dawned with an oppressive weight, as if Gloomhaven itself sensed the approaching climax. Shadows seemed to cling more stubbornly to every corner, and the perpetual twilight deepened to a premature dusk. Elara stood before the cracked mirror in her bedroom, studying her reflection. The girl who stared back was a far cry from the outcast she'd been mere weeks ago. Her eyes glowed with an inner light, and shadows danced in her hair, intertwining with the fairy folk who had made it their home. "You've come so far," Whisper murmured from his perch on her shoulder. "But the hardest test still lies ahead." As if summoned by his words, a bone-chilling scream shattered the uneasy quiet. Elara raced from the cottage, her heart pounding. In the town square, a scene of nightmarish proportions unfolded. Mayor Grimstone stood atop his makeshift platform, but his usual bluster had given way to abject terror. Inky tendrils of shadow wrapped around his limbs, slowly dragging him towards a yawning portal of darkness that had opened in the center of the square. "Help me," he cried, his eyes wild with fear. "Someone, please." Townsfolk gathered at the edges of the square, their faces masks of horror and indecision. Elara pushed through the crowd, her mind racing. This was at the moment when theory became practice, when her newfound understanding would be put to the ultimate test. As she approached the writhing mass of shadows, Elara felt twin pulses of power within her, the fierce light of the Twilight Guardians and the seductive pull of primordial darkness. For a moment, she teetered on the edge of indecision. It would be so easy to simply banish the shadows, to be the hero Gloomhaven expected. But the lessons of her dream echoed in her mind. Balance. Harmony. The space between extremes. Taking a deep breath, Elara stepped into the maelstrom of shadow. Instead of fighting against it, she opened herself to its essence, feeling its ancient hunger, its loneliness, its twisted form of love for Gloomhaven. "I see you," she whispered to the darkness. "I understand." The shadows paused in their assault, coiling around Elara like curious serpents. In that moment of connection, she glimpsed the truth behind Gloomhaven's curse, the Shadow Feeder, once a protector spirit, twisted by fear and rejection into something monstrous. With gentle hands glowing with twilight radiance, Elara began to reshape the shadows, not banishing them, but transforming them. She wove them into intricate patterns, blending light and dark into something new and beautiful. Mayor Grimstone fell to the ground, released from the shadow's grasp. But Elara barely noticed, lost in the dance of creation. The portal of darkness slowly transmuted into an arch of twilight energy, a gateway between worlds. As the last threads of shadow were woven into place, a hush fell over the square. The townsfolk stared in awe at the shimmering arch and at Elara, who stood at its center, her form flickering between light and shadow. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. From the depths of the twilight arch emerged a figure of impossible darkness, the Shadow Feeder itself, no longer content to work through emissaries. "Clever little guardian," it purred, its voice like the void between stars. "You think you understand, but you've only scratched the surface. Are you prepared to pay the true price of balance?" Before Elara could respond, the Shadow Feeder lashed out with tendrils of pure darkness. They wrapped around Lily Thornwood, who had pushed her way to the front of the crowd, and began to pull her into the Twilight realm. "No," Elara cried, reaching out with both light and shadow. But her powers seemed to slip through her grasp, as insubstantial as mist. The Shadow Feeder's laughter echoed across the square as it retreated into the arch, dragging a terrified Lily with it. "Come then, Twilight Guardian, come and claim your prize if you dare, but remember, in my realm, all debts must be paid." As the arch pulsed with otherworldly energy, Elara felt the weight of every eye in Gloomhaven upon her. The townsfolk looked to her with a mixture of hope and fear, silently pleading for salvation. But it was Thaddeus who stepped forward, his clockwork devices whirring with nervous energy. "You're not alone in this, Miss Nightshade," he said, his voice steadier than she'd ever heard it. "We stand with you." Reverend Holloway and Madame Vex moved to flank her, their faces set with grim determination. Even Mrs. Thornwood, tears streaming down her face, gave a resolute nod. Elara looked at her unlikely allies, then back at the Twilight Arch. The path ahead was fraught with peril, the outcome uncertain. But she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that this was the moment everything had been leading to. "Then let's finish this," she said, her voice ringing with the power of twilight. "For Lily, for Gloomhaven, for balance itself." As Elara stepped towards the shimmering gateway, she felt the dual nature of her power crystallize within her. Light and shadow, hope and fear, past and future all hung in perfect balance. The true night of the soul had come to Gloomhaven. But as Elara Nightshade prepared to plunge into the heart of darkness, she carried with her the light of understanding, the strength of community, and the power of twilight itself. The final battle awaited, and with it, the fate of all. Chapter 14. The Twilight Arch pulsed with eldritch energy, a yawning maw into a realm of shadow and light. Elara stood before it, her allies at her back, steeling herself for the plunge into the unknown. But as she took her first step, a voice rang out, stopping her in her tracks. "Wait." The crowd parted, revealing a figure Elara had only seen in faded photographs and fever dreams. Edgar Ravenswood, her long-absent father, strode into the square. His clothes were travel-worn, his face etched with the lines of hard-earned wisdom and regret. "Dad?" Elara whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and long-buried hope. Edgar's eyes, so like her own, met hers with a storm of emotions. "I felt the shift," he said, his voice rough with unshed tears. "The balance changing, I knew it was time to come home." The reunion was cut short by a mournful howl from the Twilight Arch. The Shadow Feeder's patience was wearing thin, and Lily's time was running out. "You can't go in there alone," Edgar said, moving to stand beside his daughter. "The Ravenswood blood runs strong in both of us. Together we might stand a chance." Elara studied her father's face, seeing the echoes of her own struggles reflected there. "Why did you leave?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for years finally finding voice. Edgar's expression crumpled with shame. "I thought I could break the cycle by leaving, by taking the Nightshade legacy far from Gloomhaven. But I was wrong, so terribly wrong." As he spoke, the shadows around them stirred, responding to the pain and regret in his voice. But rather than attack, they seemed to coalesce into living memories. Elara saw glimpses of her father's journey, years spent searching for answers, for a way to end the curse that had plagued their family for generations. "I may have failed as a father," Edgar said, his voice growing stronger, "but perhaps I can still be of use as a Twilight Guardian." The title hung in the air between them, a bridge across years of absence and misunderstanding. Elara felt a surge of emotion, anger, sorrow, and a fragile tendril of hope. Whisper, who had been uncharacteristically silent, fluttered between them. "The Ravenswood line reunited," he mused, his tiny face thoughtful. "Perhaps this is the key we've been missing." Thaddeus stepped forward, his clockwork devices chiming in harmonic resonance with the Twilight Arch. "If I may," he said, his usual nervousness replaced by scholarly excitement, "the old texts speak of the power of bloodlines, two guardians, sharing the same lineage, but walking different paths. It's unprecedented." Madame Vex's mismatched eyes gleamed with understanding. Light and shadow, experience and innocence, departure and homecoming, a perfect balance. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the Twilight Arch flared with renewed intensity. The Shadow Feeder's patience had run out. Elara looked at her father, seeing him truly for the first time. The anger and abandonment she had carried for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of completion she hadn't known she was missing. "Together then," she said, extending her hand. Edgar took it, his grip firm and reassuring. As their fingers intertwined, Elara felt a surge of power unlike anything she had experienced before. The light within her blazed brighter, while the shadows deepened and gained new depth. "For Lily," Edgar said. "For Gloomhaven." "For balance," Elara finished. With a shared nod of understanding, father and daughter stepped into the Twilight Arch. The crowd behind them gasped as the Ravenswood's forms shimmered and blurred, becoming creatures of neither light nor shadow, but of the liminal space between. As they vanished into the otherworldly portal, the air in Gloomhaven itself seemed to shift. The perpetual twilight took on a new quality, not the fearful gloom of before, but a soft, expectant radiance. Irvin Holloway looked to the sky, his weathered face alight with wonder. "And so it begins," he murmured. "The true test of the Twilight Guardians." In the square, the townsfolk huddled together, their fear giving way to a tentative hope. For the first time in living memory, the shadows of Gloomhaven didn't feel like a threat, but like a familiar embrace. As night fell on the haunted town, candles were lit in every window, not to ward off the dark, but to guide the guardians home. And in the heart of the Twilight realm, where light and shadow danced in eternal struggle, two figures stood united, ready to face the Shadow Feeder and rewrite the fate of Gloomhaven once and for all. The unexpected ally had emerged, and with him a new chapter in the town's long and shadowed history began to unfold. Chapter 15. The Twilight realm unfolded before Elara and Edgar like a fevered dream made manifest. Reality shimmered and bent, shadows taking on substance, while light became tangible threads weaving through the air. Father and daughter stood hand in hand, their forms flickering between corporeal and ethereal as they adjusted to this liminal space. "It's beautiful," Elara breathed, her voice echoing strangely in the non-air around them. Edgar nodded, his eyes wide with wonder and trepidation. "And terrible," he added. "We must be cautious. The Shadow Feeder holds power absolute here." As if summoned by his words, a cold laugh reverberated through the Twilight realm. The landscape shifted, revealing a towering citadel of shadow and light, its spires piercing an impossible sky swirling with colors that shouldn't exist. "Welcome, Guardians," the Shadow Feeder's voice purred from everywhere and nowhere. "Come, seek your prize if you dare." At the highest tower, a flicker of movement caught Elara's eye. Lily Thornwood, her small form barely visible, pressed her hands against a window of solidified shadow. "We need a plan," Edgar said, his grip on Elara's hand tightening. "We can't simply charge in." Elara closed her eyes, reaching out with her newfound senses. She could feel the ebb and flow of light and shadow, the pulse of this realm's strange magic. An idea began to form. "The balance," she murmured. "It's wrong here. Too much shadow, not enough light, but if we could even it out." Edgar's eyes lit up with understanding. A redistribution of power, but how? As they spoke, the very fabric of the realm seemed to respond to their intentions. Threads of light coalesced around them, while shadows gathered at their feet, eager to be shaped. "We craft our own reality here," Elara realized. "Our will, our imagination, it has tangible power." With a shared look of determination, father and daughter began to weave. Light and shadow twisted and merged under their guidance, forming tools, weapons, and shields born of twilight itself. As they worked, Elara felt memories and knowledge not her own flowing through her. Edgar's years of research, his encounters with other realms and entities, all became accessible to her. In turn, she felt her own experiences, her connection to the fairy folk, her understanding of Gloomhaven's true nature flowing into him. "The Shadow Feeder isn't just a monster," Edgar said suddenly, his voice filled with revelation. It's a part of Gloomhaven itself, a guardian twisted by fear and isolation." Elara nodded, the pieces falling into place. "We don't need to destroy it. We need to heal it, to remind it of its true purpose." As their plan took shape, so too did their creations. A staff of pure twilight energy for Elara, crackling with the power to both illuminate and darken. A cloak for Edgar that shifted between absolute shadow and blinding light, offering both concealment and revelation. But their greatest creation was a sphere of perfectly balanced twilight, neither light nor dark, but the harmony of both. Within it, they wove the essence of Gloomhaven itself, the hopes and fears of its people, the whispers of the whispering woods, the ticking of Thaddeus's clocks, the prayers of Reverend Holloway, the arcane knowledge of Madame Bex. "This," Elara said, cradling the sphere, "is our key, our reminder to the Shadow Feeder of what it once was, what it could be again." Edgar placed his hand over hers, and together they felt the pulse of Gloomhaven's heart beating within the sphere. "And our anchor," he added, "our way home." As they made their final preparations, the citadel before them seemed to twist and writhe, as if sensing the challenge to come. The Shadow Feeder's laughter echoed once more, but underneath it, Elara thought she detected a note of uncertainty. "Are you ready?" Edgar asked, his face set with determination. Elara took a deep breath, feeling the power of twilight coursing through her veins. She thought of Lily, of Gloomhaven, of the delicate balance between light and shadow that had been disrupted for so long. "I am," she said, her voice ringing with certainty. "Let's remind the Shadow Feeder of who it truly is." Father and daughter, Twilight Guardians united, turned to face the citadel. The air around them crackled with potential, light and shadow swirling in anticipation of the confrontation to come. As they took their first steps towards the Shadow Feeder's lair, Elara felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what she had been preparing for all along, not a battle of destruction, but a journey of healing and restoration. The climax approached, and with it, the fate of Gloomhaven hung in the balance. But armed with understanding, united in purpose, and wielding the very essence of Twilight itself, Elara and Edgar Ravenswood were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The time had come to bring true balance to Gloomhaven, once and for all. Chapter 16. The citadel of the Shadow Feeder loomed before them, an impossible architecture of light and shadow that seemed to defy the very laws of reality. As Elara and Edgar approached, the air grew thick with whispers, the accumulated fears and secrets of generations of Gloomhaven's residents. "Welcome, Guardians," the Shadow Feeder's voice reverberated through the Twilight realm, a symphony of seduction and malice. "Come, let me show you the futility of your quest." The ground beneath their feet shifted, and suddenly Elara and Edgar found themselves within the citadel's grand hall. Shadows danced along the walls, taking the shape of Gloomhaven's history, the founding, the first pact, the centuries of sacrifice. "Do you see now?" the Shadow Feeder purred, its form coalescing before them, a being of pure darkness, wrapped in tendrils of stolen light. "I am Gloomhaven's protector, its very foundation. Without me, your precious town would have fallen to far greater horrors long ago." Edgar stepped forward, his twilight cloak billowing around him. "We understand your purpose," he said, his voice steady. "But the price has become too high. The balance is broken." The Shadow Feeder's laughter was like shattering glass. "Balance. There is no balance in this world, foolish guardian. Only power, and those too weak to seek it." As it spoke, the shadows around them writhed and took new shape. Elara gasped as she saw visions of Gloomhaven's possible futures, one bathed in blinding, merciless light that burned away all nuance and mystery, another swallowed by absolute darkness where hope withered and died. "This is the truth you refuse to see," the Shadow Feeder hissed. "Light or dark, feast or famine, there is no middle ground." But even as it wove its web of despair, Elara felt the sphere of twilight energy pulse in her hands. She looked to her father, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. "You're wrong," Elara said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "True balance isn't the absence of extremes, it's the harmony between them. Let us show you." Before the Shadow Feeder could respond, Elara and Edgar began to weave their twilight magic. Light and shadow danced around them, forming images of Gloomhaven, as it could be a town where day and night coexisted in perfect equilibrium, where mystery and knowledge walked hand in hand. The Shadow Feeder recoiled, its form flickering uncertainly. "Impossible," it snarled. "You cannot undo centuries of—" Its words were cut short as a small voice rang out from above. "Elara, Mr. Ravenswood." They looked up to see Lily Thornwood, her face pressed against a window of solidified shadow. The sight of the child seemed to trigger something in the Shadow Feeder. Its form wavered, and for a moment, Elara glimpsed its true nature, not a monster, but a guardian spirit twisted by loneliness and the burden of its duty. "The children," Edgar breathed, realization dawning. "They weren't just sacrifices, they were companions." The Shadow Feeder's response was a howl of mingled rage and anguish. "You understand nothing. I protected them, sheltered them from a world that would corrupt their innocence. I am their savior." But Elara could see the truth now. "You love them," she said softly. "But love without freedom, without balance, becomes a cage." She held out the sphere of twilight energy, its perfectly balanced light casting the Shadow Feeder's chamber in a soft, revealing glow. Within its depths, they could all see the heart of Gloomhaven beating a rhythm of light and shadow, joy and sorrow, mystery and revelation. The Shadow Feeder's form began to unravel, its carefully constructed illusions falling away. "No," it whispered, its voice losing its otherworldly resonance. "No, I only wanted to protect," Edgar finished. "We know, but it's time to find a new way together." As the last of the Shadow Feeder's defenses crumbled, the true scope of its machinations was revealed. Centuries of manipulation, of carefully orchestrated fear and selective salvation, all born from a misguided desire to preserve innocence at any cost. But in that moment of vulnerability, of truth laid bare, Elara saw not a villain to be vanquished, but a wounded guardian in desperate need of healing. She stepped forward, the sphere of twilight held out like an offering. "It's time to remember who you truly are," she said. "Not a devourer of innocence, but a protector of balance. Will you join us in bringing true harmony to Gloomhaven?" The chamber held its breath, light and shadow trembling on the edge of transformation. The fate of Gloomhaven, of the Shadow Feeder itself, hung in the balance of this moment. And in the silence that followed Elara's question, the very fabric of reality seemed to await the answer that would reshape everything. Chapter 17. The Shadow Feeder's form wavered, a maelstrom of light and dark roiling within its ethereal body. Elara and Edgar stood firm, the sphere of twilight energy pulsing between them like a beacon of hope in the chaotic chamber. "You cannot undo what has been done," the Shadow Feeder's voice echoed, a mixture of defiance and despair. "The pact, the sacrifices, the very foundation of Gloomhaven, all are woven into my being." Elara took a step forward, her resolve unwavering. "Then we'll reweave it together." As if triggered by her words, the chamber began to shift and transform. The walls melted away, revealing a spiraling pathway that led deep into the heart of the Twilight realm. At its center, a pulsing core of pure, primal energy, the source of the Shadow Feeder's power and the nexus of Gloomhaven's fate. "The final test," Edgar murmured, understanding dawning in his eyes. "We must journey to the very heart of darkness to bring balance." Lily's voice called out from above, "I'm coming too." Before anyone could protest, she had slipped through the window of shadow, landing lightly beside Elara. The girl's presence seemed to cause the Shadow Feeder physical pain, its form contorting as it struggled between its instinct to protect and its compulsion to consume. "Very well," Elara said, taking Lily's hand. "We face this together, past, present, and future united." As they began their descent, the path beneath their feet shifted with each step. Memories of Gloomhaven's history played out around them, moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and despair. Elara saw generations of Nightshades standing guard against the encroaching darkness, their faces a mirror of her own determination. The deeper they went, the more resistant the realm became. Shadows lashed out like whips, while piercing beams of light threatened to blind them. But Elara and Edgar wove their twilight magic in perfect harmony, creating a protective bubble around themselves and Lily. "Look!" Lily cried out, pointing ahead. Suspended in the swirling energy were the missing children of Gloomhaven, their forms translucent and dreamlike. Among them, Elara spotted Timothy Hollow, his eyes closed as if in peaceful slumber. The Shadow Feeder's voice resonated from the very air around them. "My charges, my precious innocents, would you rob them of eternal peace, of protection from the harsh realities of your world?" Edgar's face was etched with compassion and determination. They deserve the chance to live, to grow, to experience both light and shadow. That is the true nature of innocence, not an unchanging state, but a journey of discovery. As they neared the core, the resistance grew stronger. The very fabric of reality seemed to rebel against their presence. Elara felt her strength waning, the weight of generations of conflict pressing down upon her. But then she felt Lily's small hand squeeze hers, saw the trust and hope shining in the girl's eyes. "We can do it, Elara," Lily said with the unshakable faith of a child. "We can make things right." Drawing strength from Lily's belief and her father's unwavering support, Elara raised the sphere of twilight energy high. Its perfectly balanced light cast the chaotic core into sharp relief, revealing the tangled threads of light and shadow that formed the heart of Gloomhaven's curse. "Now," Elara breathed, "we reweave the tapestry." With a shared look of understanding, Elara, Edgar, and Lily plunged their hands into the core. The sensation was indescribable: searing heat and freezing cold, blinding light and impenetrable darkness, all warring for dominance. But guided by the sphere's balanced energy, they began to reshape the very essence of Gloomhaven's reality. Threads of light and shadow intertwined, forming new patterns of harmony and equilibrium. The Shadow Feeder howled, its form dissolving and reconstituting with each adjustment. "What are you doing?" it cried, its voice a mixture of agony and awe. "Reminding you of your true purpose," Elara said through gritted teeth. "Not to devour or to blind, but to guard the balance between light and shadow." As the final threads fell into place, a shockwave of pure twilight energy exploded outward. Elara caught a glimpse of the suspended children stirring, of the citadel crumbling away, to reveal a sky where sun and moon shared the same space. Then, in a rush of sound and sensation, they were falling, tumbling back towards Gloomhaven and whatever new reality awaited them. The journey to the heart of darkness was complete, but as Elara clung to her father and Lily, she knew that the true test living in the world they had reshaped was only just beginning. Chapter 18. The world resolved itself around Elara, Edgar, and Lily as they materialized in Gloomhaven's town square. The air shimmered with residual twilight energy, and for a moment, the boundaries between realms seemed as thin as gossamer. Elara blinked, adjusting to the new reality they had wrought. Gloomhaven was different. The perpetual gloom had lifted, replaced by a soft, pearlescent light that seemed to emanate from the very cobblestones. Shadows still lingered in corners and alleyways, but they danced playfully rather than threatening to engulf. The townsfolk emerged from their homes, wonder and trepidation warring on their faces. Thaddeus Gloom's clock tower chimed a melody that spoke of new beginnings, while Reverend Holloway's church bells rang out in joyous counterpoint. But the moment of all was shattered by a heart-wrenching wail. Mrs. Thornwood rushed forward, sweeping Lily into a tearful embrace. "My child, my precious child," she sobbed, her relief palpable. As if triggered by this reunion, the air shimmered once more. Ghostly forms began to materialize throughout the square. The lost children of Gloomhaven returned at last from their twilight slumber. Elara's heart swelled as she watched families reunited, years of grief and longing giving way to joy. But a pang of sadness struck her as she realized not all the children had living relatives to welcome them home. "What will happen to them?" she asked softly, looking to her father. Edgar's face was a mixture of determination and regret. "We'll care for them," he said. "All of us. It's time Gloomhaven remember how to be a true community." As the initial shock and elation began to subside, Elara felt a familiar presence stirring. The Shadow Feeder, or what remained of it, coalesced before them, its form now a perfect blend of light and shadow. "What have you done?" it asked, its voice a whisper of awe and confusion. Elara stepped forward, the sphere of twilight energy still pulsing gently in her hands. "We've restored balance," she said. "Reminded you of your true purpose. You're not a devourer, but a guardian of both light and shadow, innocence and wisdom." The being that had once been the Shadow Feeder regarded them with eyes that held the depth of centuries. "I remember," it said slowly. "The pact, the duty, the love that turned to obsession. I lost my way." "We all did," Edgar added, placing a comforting hand on Elara's shoulder. "But now we have a chance to make things right." Mayor Grimstone pushed his way through the crowd, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. "What is the meaning of this?" he blustered. "The children? The shadows? What have you done to our town?" Elara met his gaze steadily. "We've given Gloomhaven a second chance, Mayor, a chance to confront its past and build a better future." As if to punctuate her words, a shaft of true sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in living memory. The townsfolk gasped, shielding their eyes from the unfamiliar brightness. Madame Vex stepped forward, her mismatched eyes gleaming with understanding. "The veil has thinned," she announced. "Magic and mystery will walk hand in hand with science and reason. Gloomhaven will never be the same." Reverend Holloway nodded solemnly. "Nor should it be. We've lived too long in fear of our own shadows. It's time we learn to embrace both the light and the dark within us all." The reformed Shadow Feeder bowed its head. "I offer myself in service to this new Gloomhaven," it said. "No longer a being of hunger, but a guardian of balance." Elara felt the weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders once more. The crisis might be averted, but the real work of healing and transformation was just beginning. "There will be challenges ahead," she addressed the gathered townsfolk. "Old fears to overcome, new realities to accept. But if we stand together, embracing both the light and shadow within us, there's nothing we cannot face." As she spoke, Elara felt a shift within herself. The power of the Twilight Guardian flowed through her veins, no longer a burden, but a gift to be shared. She looked to her father, seeing the same revelation reflected in his eyes. The confrontation with the past was complete. Gloomhaven's long night of fear and sacrifice had ended. But as the sun and moon shared the sky in perfect harmony, Elara knew that the most profound journey, that of rebuilding and redemption, was only just beginning. With the sphere of twilight energy held high, a beacon of hope and balance, Elara Nightshade prepared to lead her town into a future where light and shadow danced as partners, not adversaries. The true story of Gloomhaven was about to unfold. Chapter 19. As the initial wave of joy and disbelief washed over Gloomhaven, a tremor ran through the ground. The air crackled with residual twilight energy, and Elara felt a surge of foreboding. "It's not over," she whispered, her eyes meeting her father's. Edgar nodded grimly. "The old magic doesn't give up so easily." As if summoned by their words, the shadows in the square began to writhe and coalesce. The reformed Shadow Feeder let out a cry of anguish as tendrils of darkness tore away from its newly balanced form. "The curse," Irvin Holloway shouted. "It's fighting back." Before their eyes, the torn shadows twisted into a monstrous apparition, a dark echo of the Shadow Feeder's former self, fueled by centuries of fear and misguided purpose. Elara stepped forward, the sphere of twilight energy pulsing in her hands. "Everyone, stay back," she called out. "Dad, we need to contain this." As the townsfolk scrambled for safety, Elara and Edgar began to weave a complex pattern of light and shadow around the roiling mass of darkness. But for every thread they created, the shadow creature lashed out, tearing through their defenses. It's too strong. Edgar grunted, sweat beading on his brow. Thaddeus Gloom pushed through the crowd, his clockwork devices whirring frantically. The old magics are tied to the town's very foundations, he explained breathlessly. We need to ground it, redirect its energy. Madame Vex appeared at Elara's side, her mismatched eyes gleaming with determination. Child, you must draw upon the town itself. The stones, the trees, the very air all hold memories of balance. Understanding bloomed in Elara's mind. She closed her eyes, reaching out with her senses to touch the essence of Gloomhaven. She felt the whispers of the whispering woods, the steady tick of Thaddeus's clocks, the hopes and fears of generations woven into every cobblestone. Now, she cried, her eyes snapping open. As one, the unlikely group of allies joined hands. Elara and Edgar channeled the town's energy through the sphere, while Thaddeus's devices hummed in harmonic resonance. Madame Vex chanted in an arcane tongue, and Reverend Holloway's prayers rose to meet her incantations. The shadow creature howled, thrashing against the onslaught of pure, balanced twilight energy. But for every attack, the defenders of Gloomhaven had a counter. Where it struck with darkness, Elara wove threads of light. When it lashed out with searing brightness, Edgar tempered it with soothing shadow. Lily Thornwood, breaking free from her mother's grasp, darted forward. I want to help, she cried, her small hand reaching for the sphere. Lily, no. Mrs. Thornwood screamed, but it was too late. The moment Lily's fingers touched the sphere, a surge of pure, innocent energy flooded through the network. The shadow creature recoiled, its form beginning to unravel. Elara saw their chance. Everyone, she shouted to the gathered townsfolk. Think of Gloomhaven as you want it to be a place of balance, of hope, of harmony between light and shadow. The air itself seemed to hum as the collective will of Gloomhaven focused on the battle. Tendrils of memory and desire swirled around the shadow creature, binding it, reshaping it. With a final earth-shaking roar, the dark apparition exploded in a nova of twilight energy. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, like a gentle rain, motes of perfectly balanced light and shadow began to fall, settling over the town like a blessing. As the dust settled, Elara looked around in awe. Gloomhaven had transformed. The perpetual gloom was gone, replaced by a soft, ethereal light that seemed to emanate from within every stone and tree. Shadows still lingered, but they danced playfully, no longer menacing. The reformed shadow figure approached, its form now truly balanced between light and dark. It is done, it said, its voice a harmony of whispers. The old curse is broken, and a new era begins. Elara felt the weight of the moment settle upon her. She looked to her father, to her allies, to the townsfolk who had stood strong in the face of chaos. We did it, she breathed. We saved Gloomhaven. But even as joy and relief washed over her, Elara knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The true work of maintaining balance, of healing old wounds and forging a new path, lay ahead. As the sun and moon shared the sky in perfect harmony, casting the town in a perpetual beautiful twilight, Elara Nightshade squared her shoulders. The final battle was won, but the journey of Gloomhaven and its Twilight Guardian was far from over. Chapter 20. The dust of battle had barely settled when Elara felt a sharp tug at her very being. The sphere of twilight energy in her hands pulsed erratically, its perfect balance wavering. Something's wrong, she gasped, looking to her father with wide eyes. Edgar's face was etched with concern. The old magics, he said gravely. They demand a final price. The reformed shadow feeder drifted closer, its voice a melancholy whisper. Balance has been restored, but it must be maintained. An anchor is needed, a living bridge between light and shadow. Realization dawned on Elara, cold and heavy in her chest. A sacrifice, she breathed. The townsfolk murmured uneasily, the joy of victory quickly souring. Mayor Grimstone stepped forward, his face ashen. Surely there must be another way, he pleaded. We can't lose you, Miss Nightshade, not after everything. Elara felt the weight of destiny pressing down upon her. She looked around at the faces of those she had fought so hard to protect: Lily's wide-eyed innocence, Thaddeus's nervous determination, Madame Vex's enigmatic wisdom. Could she really leave them behind? I'll do it, Edgar said suddenly, stepping forward. It should be me. I've lived my life, made my mistakes. Let me make amends. No, Elara cried, reaching for her father's hand. After so long apart, the thought of losing him again was unbearable. But before either Nightshade could make a move, a small voice piped up. What if no one had to go away forever? All eyes turned to Lily Thornwood. The young girl stood tall, her face set with a wisdom beyond her years. The Shadow Feeder used to take children to maintain balance, right? But that was wrong, because it was all or nothing. What if we all shared a little bit? A thoughtful hush fell over the square. Thaddeus's clockwork devices whirred as he considered the idea. A distributed anchor, he mused. Ingenious in its simplicity. Madame Vex nodded slowly, her mismatched eyes gleaming. The child speaks true. If every soul in Gloomhaven were to offer a fraction of themselves, it would be more than enough to maintain the balance. The reformed Shadow Feeder's form shimmered with what might have been hope. It has never been attempted, it said. But perhaps this is the true meaning of community. Elara looked to her father, seeing her own mix of hope and trepidation reflected in his eyes. It would mean changing everyone, she said softly. Gloomhaven would never be the same. Edgar squeezed her hand. Perhaps that's exactly what this town needs. With a deep breath, Elara turned to address the gathered townsfolk. The choice is yours, she said, her voice carrying across the square. We can maintain the balance together, but it will mean embracing both light and shadow within yourselves. It won't always be easy, but I believe it's the path to true harmony. A moment of silence fell, heavy with the weight of decision. Then, slowly at first, but with growing momentum, heads began to nod. Reverend Holloway stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. We have lived too long in fear of our own shadows, he said. It's time we learned to dance with them instead. One by one, the people of Gloomhaven voiced their agreement. Even Mayor Grimstone, after a moment's hesitation, gave a gruff nod of assent. With a shared look of understanding, Elara and Edgar raised the sphere of twilight energy high. Together then, Elara said, her voice thick with emotion. As one, the townsfolk reached out, each touching the sphere or connecting with those around them. The air crackled with potential as Elara began to sing the melody of the Twilight Guardians, her voice joined by her father's deeper tones. Light and shadow swirled around them, weaving into each person's very being. Elara felt a profound shift within herself, not a loss, but a completion. She saw the same transformation reflected in the faces around her, awe and wonder replacing fear and doubt. When the song faded and the light settled, Gloomhaven stood transformed. The town glowed with a soft, inner radiance, while shadows danced playfully along the streets. But the most striking change was in the people themselves. Each now carried a perfect balance of light and shadow within them, their eyes shimmering with newfound understanding. The reformed Shadow Feeder bowed low. It is done, it said, its voice a chorus of whispers. Gloomhaven is reborn, and I with it. no longer a devourer, but a true guardian of balance. As the reality of their sacrifice and transformation sank in, Elara felt a profound sense of both accomplishment and trepidation. A hard-won balance would need to be maintained, nurtured, and protected. But as she looked around at the faces of her fellow townsfolk, no longer divided by fear, but united in purpose, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, Gloomhaven would face them together. The age of Twilight had truly begun. Chapter 21. Dawn broke over Gloomhaven, but it was unlike any sunrise the town had ever known. Soft tendrils of light intertwined with playful shadows, casting the world in a perpetual state of twilight that was both familiar and utterly new. Elara stood at the edge of the town square, watching as the citizens of Gloomhaven began to stir. The events of the previous night had left an indelible mark on everyone, and she could see the mixture of wonder and trepidation on their faces as they emerged from their homes. "It's really over, isn't it?" Lily asked, appearing at Elara's side. The young girl's eyes now held a depth that spoke of the wisdom she'd gained. Elara smiled, ruffling Lily's hair affectionately. "The battle is over, yes, but our journey, that's just beginning." As if to punctuate her words, a shimmer of twilight energy danced across the cobblestones. The townsfolk gasped, some in delight, others in nervousness. Thaddeus Gloom hurried over, his pockets chiming with the sound of a dozen tiny clockwork devices. "Fascinating," he exclaimed, adjusting his spectacles. "The residual energy seems to be integrating with the town's very essence. Gloomhaven is becoming a twilight realm in its own right." Madame Vex glided through the crowd, her mismatched eyes gleaming. "Indeed," she murmured, "the veil between worlds has thinned. Magic and mundane will dance together in ways we've yet to imagine." As the implications of their transformation began to sink in, Elara could sense a ripple of unease moving through the gathered citizens. Mayor Grimstone cleared his throat, stepping forward with an air of forced authority. "Now see here," he began, his jowls quivering. "We can't have shadows dancing about willy-nilly. There must be order, rules." "There will be," Edgar interrupted, placing a calming hand on the mayor's shoulder. "But they must be new rules, Mayor, ones that embrace both light and shadow." Reverend Holloway nodded sagely. "Our old ways of thinking no longer serve us. We must learn to see with new eyes, to find balance in every aspect of our lives." As the adults debated the finer points of governing a twilight town, Elara noticed a group of children gathered near the old fountain. To her amazement, they were laughing and playing with small orbs of light and shadow, shaping them into fantastical creatures. "They adapt so quickly," the reformed shadow feeder mused, materializing beside Elara. Its form was still striking a perfect blend of light and dark, but no longer inspired fear in those who beheld it. Elara nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "They don't carry the weight of our old fears and prejudices. Perhaps they'll be our best teachers in this new world." As the morning wore on, the initial shock began to give way to cautious excitement. Thaddeus organized impromptu classes on practical applications of twilight energy, while Madame Vex offered readings to help citizens understand their new inner balance. Even the whispering woods seemed to have been affected by the change. The trees at the edge of town swayed gently, their leaves shimmering with an inner light. Elara could have sworn she saw faces peering out from the shadows between the trunks, fairy folk and other mystical creatures, drawn to the new wellspring of balanced energy. As she watched her transformed town take its first tentative steps into a new era, Elara felt a profound sense of both accomplishment and responsibility. The sphere of twilight energy still pulsed gently in her hands, a reminder of the power they now all shared. "What happens now?" Lily asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Elara knelt down, meeting the girl's gaze. Now we learn, we grow, we find out what it truly means to live in balance. She stood, addressing the gathered townsfolk with a voice that carried the weight of her newfound role as Twilight Guardian. Gloomhaven has always been a place apart from the rest of the world. Now, we have the chance to become something truly extraordinary, a beacon of harmony between light and shadow. As her words settled over the crowd, Elara saw hope blooming on faces that had known only fear for generations. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in living memory, the future of Gloomhaven shone bright with possibility. The ordinary world they had known was gone, transformed into something magical and new. But as Elara looked around at the faces of her friends and neighbors, now illuminated by their own inner twilight, she knew that they were ready to embrace whatever wonders and challenges awaited them in this new dawn. Chapter 22. As days turned to weeks, Gloomhaven settled into a rhythm as unique as its newly transformed nature. The perpetual twilight that bathed the town no longer felt strange or unsettling, but rather like a comfortable blanket woven from equal parts light and shadow. Elara stood atop the clock tower, surveying the town she had grown to love in an entirely new way. Below, the streets bustled with activity, citizens going about their daily lives with an added spring in their step and a twinkle of twilight in their eyes. "Quite a view, isn't it?" Thaddeus remarked, joining her on the tower's balcony. His pockets still chimed with clockwork, but now they seemed to tick in harmony with the pulse of twilight energy that flowed through the town. Elara nodded, a smile playing on her lips. "It's more than I ever could have imagined." Indeed, Gloomhaven had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The Whispering Woods had crept closer to the town's borders, no longer a foreboding presence, but a mysterious ally. Fairy folk could often be spotted flitting between the trees, some even venturing into town to trade secrets and stories with the curious residents. In the town square, Madame Vax had set up a permanent stall, offering twilight readings and teaching basic energy manipulation to eager students. Her mismatched eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she watched young and old alike learn to shape small orbs of light and shadow. Even the church had undergone a metamorphosis. Reverend Holloway had thrown open the doors, replacing the heady curtains with stained glass that cast ever-shifting patterns of twilight across the floor. His sermons now spoke of balance and harmony, drawing parallels between the town's transformation and spiritual growth. "You know," Thaddeus mused, his gaze distant, "I used to fear the ticking of my clocks. Each second that passed felt like a step closer to some inevitable doom. But now—" He trailed off, gesturing to the scene below. Elara understood. Time itself seemed to move differently in this new Gloomhaven. Not slower or faster, but with a fluidity that matched the ebb and flow of twilight energy. A commotion in the street drew their attention. A group of children, led by an enthusiastic Lily Thornwood, were engaged in what appeared to be a game of twilight tag. As Elara watched, Lily called out a phrase in a language that sounded ancient and new all at once. The shadows around her coalesced, forming a playful cloak that helped her dodge her pursuers. "They adapt so quickly," Elara murmured, echoing the Shadowfeeder's words from weeks ago. Thaddeus nodded sagely. "Children see the world as it is, not as we believe it should be. Perhaps that's why they've taken to this change so readily." As if summoned by their conversation, the reformed Shadowfeeder materialized beside them. Its presence no longer inspired fear, but rather a sense of comforting watchfulness. "The balance holds," it said, its voice a harmony of whispers, "but it requires constant nurturing." Elara nodded, feeling the weight of her role as Twilight Guardian settle upon her shoulders once more. There's still so much to learn, to understand. Indeed, not everything had been smooth sailing in this new reality. Some citizens struggled to adapt, clinging to old fears and prejudices. Mayor Grimstone, in particular, had needed considerable coaxing to embrace the new order of things. But for every challenge, there seemed to be a breakthrough. Just the other day, Edgar had discovered a way to use twilight energy to purify the town's water supply, making it sweeter and more nourishing than ever before. As the sun and moon shared the sky in their eternal dance, Elara felt a surge of pride and wonder. Gloomhaven had faced its darkness, embraced its light, and emerged as something truly unique. "We're not just a town anymore, are we?" she mused aloud. Thaddeus chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "No, my dear, we're a beacon, a testament to what can happen when light and shadow learn to dance together." The Shadow Feeder's form shimmered in agreement. A new age dawns, one of balance, of harmony, of endless possibility. As Elara descended the clock tower to join the bustling life of the town, she carried with her a profound sense of both accomplishment and anticipation. The journey that had begun with fear and isolation had led to a community more tightly knit and vibrantly alive than ever before. Gloomhaven's reality had shifted, expanded, become something magical and new. And as Elara stepped into the perpetual twilight, ready to face whatever challenges and wonders awaited, she knew that this was only the beginning of their extraordinary tale. Chapter 23. As the seasons turned, Gloomhaven flourished in its newfound balance. The perpetual twilight that once signified dread now painted the town in hues of possibility. Elara Nightshade, no longer an outcast but a beacon of hope, found herself at the heart of this transformation. On this particular evening, Elara stood at the edge of the Whispering Woods, preparing for what had become a weekly ritual. Around her gathered an eclectic group: Lily Thornwood, eyes bright with excitement; Thaddeus Gloom, his pockets chiming softly; Madame Vex, her mismatched eyes gleaming with arcane knowledge; and even Mayor Grimstone, who had finally begun to embrace the town's new reality. "Are we ready to begin?" Elara asked, her voice carrying the gentle authority of a true Twilight Guardian. As the group nodded their assent, Elara closed her eyes and reached out with her senses. She felt the pulse of twilight energy flowing through the town, through the woods, through every living being. With a deep breath, she began to sing. The melody that poured from her lips was unlike anything the old Gloomhaven had ever known. It spoke of shadow and light, of mystery and revelation, of the delicate balance that now defined their existence. As she sang, the others joined in, their voices weaving a tapestry of harmony that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Slowly, magical beings began to emerge from the Whispering Woods. Fairy folk danced on motes of twilight, while shadowy creatures with glowing eyes peered curiously from behind trees. The barrier between worlds, once so rigid, had become permeable, allowing for a communion of realities. "Remarkable," Thaddeus breathed, his scientific mind struggling to categorize the wonders before him. "Every week, it's as if we're seeing it for the first time." Madame Vex nodded sagely. "The Twilight Realm is ever-changing, dear Thaddeus. That is its nature. And now it is ours as well." As the magical gathering continued, Elara felt a familiar presence materialize beside her. The reformed Shadow Feeder, now a guardian of balance, observed the scene with what could only be described as contentment. "You have done well, Twilight Guardian," it murmured, its voice a blend of shadow and light. "Gloomhaven has truly embraced its new nature." Elara smiled, but there was a hint of wistfulness in her eyes. "Most of us have," she agreed, glancing towards the town. For while Gloomhaven had largely adapted to its transformed state, there were still those who struggled. Some citizens found the constant twilight disorienting, longing for the clear delineation of day and night. Others grappled with the magical abilities they had gained, fearful of the power that now resided within them. As if sensing her thoughts, Lily approached, her young face set with determination. "We can help them, can't we, Elara, like you helped me?" Elara knelt down, meeting the girl's gaze. "We can try, Lily, but embracing one's true nature, especially when that nature has changed so profoundly, it's not always an easy journey." Mayor Grimstone cleared his throat, an uncharacteristic vulnerability in his voice. "Indeed, some of us, well, we're still learning to dance with our shadows, as it were." The gathered group fell silent, contemplating the challenges that still lay ahead. But then, as if in response to their unspoken concerns, a new sound filled the air. From the heart of the whispering woods came a melody both ancient and new, sung by voices that seemed to belong to the trees themselves. The fairy folk began to dance with renewed vigor, their movements weaving patterns of light and shadow in the air. And as the citizens of Gloomhaven watched in awe, they felt something shift within themselves. Elara felt it too, a deepening of the connection between all things, a reminder of the delicate balance they now embodied. She understood then that embracing their true nature wasn't about perfection or constant harmony. It was about acknowledging both the light and shadow within, and finding strength in that duality. As the magical gathering began to wind down, Elara addressed the assembled group. "We're all still learning," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of her experiences. "But that's the beauty of what we've become. Every day is a new opportunity to discover what it means to live in twilight, to be beings of both shadow and light." The reformed shadow feeder nodded in agreement. The journey of self-discovery never truly ends. That is the gift and the challenge of true balance. As they made their way back into town, the citizens of Gloomhaven carried with them a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead might not always be easy, but they would walk it together, embracing the twilight in all its complexity. Elara lingered for a moment at the edge of the woods, watching as the last of the fairy folk disappeared into the shadows. She felt the weight of her role as Twilight Guardian, but also the strength that came from truly embracing her nature. With a smile that held both joy and determination, Elara turned and walked into the perpetual twilight of Gloomhaven, ready to guide her people through whatever wonders and challenges awaited in their ever-evolving reality. Chapter 24. A year had passed since the Great Transformation, and Gloomhaven stood as a testament to the power of balance and acceptance. The town, once shrouded in perpetual gloom, now basked in the gentle radiance of eternal twilight. Shadows danced playfully alongside beams of soft light, a visual representation of the harmony that had been achieved. Elara Nightshade stood atop the clock tower, her hair swirling with tiny fairy folk, as she gazed out over the town she had helped reshape. Below, the streets buzzed with a vibrancy that would have been unthinkable in the old Gloomhaven. "Quite a view, isn't it?" came a familiar voice. Edgar Ravenswood joined his daughter, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of pride and wonder. Elara nodded, a smile playing on her lips. "It's more than I ever dreamed possible." Indeed, Gloomhaven had become something truly unique. The whispering woods had grown closer, its edges now seamlessly blending with the town proper. Magical creatures could often be seen going about their business alongside human residents, the once rigid boundaries between realms now beautifully blurred. In the town square, Thaddeus Gloom had set up an open-air workshop, where he taught the principles of twilight mechanics, a new field that combined his clockwork expertise with the magical energies that now permeated the town. His latest creation, a fountain that told time through intricate patterns of light and shadow, had become the square's centerpiece. Nearby, Madame Vex's fortune-telling tent had expanded into a full-fledged school of twilight arts. Students of all ages gathered to learn the delicate balance of light and shadow magic, their practice sessions filling the air with shimmering displays of controlled twilight energy. Even the church had embraced change. Reverend Holloway could be seen leading a group in meditation, teaching them to find inner balance by connecting with the twilight energies that flowed through all things. "We've come so far," Edgar mused, his voice tinged with emotion. "But the journey is far from over." Elara nodded, understanding the bittersweet nature of their triumph. For while Gloomhaven had flourished, the world beyond remained largely unchanged. Travelers who stumbled upon the town often reacted with a mixture of wonder and fear, some embracing the magical reality, others fleeing from what they didn't understand. "Do you think we'll ever be able to share this with the outside world?" Elara asked, voicing the question that had been on many minds. Before Edgar could respond, a shimmering form materialized beside them, the reformed Shadow Feeder, now guardian of balance. "Perhaps, in time," it said, its voice a harmony of whispers. "But remember, Twilight Guardian, change must come from within. Just as Gloomhaven had to face its shadows to find balance, so too must the world beyond." As if to emphasize its point, a commotion arose from the town gates. A group of wide-eyed travelers had arrived, their faces a mix of awe and trepidation as they took in the twilight realm before them. Elara watched as Lily Thornwood, now a confident young woman, approached the newcomers with a welcoming smile. The girl who had once been afraid of her own shadow now moved with the grace of one fully at ease in a world of dualities. "Welcome to Gloomhaven," Lily's voice carried up to the clock tower, "where light and shadow dance as one." As the travelers were led into town, Elara felt a familiar mix of hope and apprehension. Each new arrival brought the potential for understanding, but also the risk of misunderstanding. "It won't always be easy," Edgar said, placing a comforting hand on Elara's shoulder. "But then, nothing worthwhile ever is." Elara nodded, feeling the weight of her role as Twilight Guardian settle upon her once more. She knew that the future held challenges, helping newcomers adapt, maintaining the delicate balance they had achieved, and perhaps one day, sharing their hard-won wisdom with the world beyond. But as she looked out over Gloomhaven, at the harmony of light and shadow, at the community that had grown stronger through adversity, Elara felt a surge of determination. "We're ready," she said, her voice ringing with quiet confidence. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together in perfect twilight." As the sun and moon shared the sky in their eternal dance, casting the town in a soft, otherworldly glow, Elara Nightshade stepped back from the clock tower's edge. The story of Gloomhaven's transformation had reached its end, but in many ways it was only the beginning. For in this town where shadow and light intertwined, where magic and mundane walked hand in hand, a new chapter was always waiting to be written. And Elara, once an outcast, now stood ready to guide her people through whatever wonders and challenges the twilight might bring. The tale of Gloomhaven, of balance restored and a world forever changed, would echo through the ages, a testament to the power of embracing both the light and shadow within us all.